Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the post-lunch session. My name is Luke Pendergrass. I'm a recent graduate here at Seattle Pacific University. And today we have, for this session, a nice representation of clinical psychology, moral and educational philosophy, and some neuroscience. First speaking will be Liz Kumrai from Pepperdine University, Tapio Pulmatka from the University of Jyväskylä, Finland, and Adam Johnson from Bethel. So please enjoy. Please welcome our first speaker today.
All right, I've been enjoying this so far, getting to see where all of these projects have gone. So thank you all for sharing your projects. Okay, so I'm talking today about a study that evaluated various practices focused on spiritual formation among college students at Pepperdine. And you can see here a quote from George Pepperdine, the founder of Pepperdine College, now the university where I conducted this study. And this kind of embodies the spirit in which spiritual formation practices are offered to students on campus, with the idea that that might teach them something about how to live, so how to live a life of purpose and meaning. So since I'm focusing on practices intended to promote spiritual formation, I'm just going to briefly mention how spiritual formation is conceptualized for the context of this study. It is basically focusing on a transformation into the image of Christ. And it's based on various writings. For example, Dallas Willard's focus on taking on the character of Christ through a transformation of the spirit. Or Henry Nouwen, who writes about there being a sacred voice that calls us the beloved, and how being the beloved is really the fundamental truth of existence. Or Hagberg and Gulick's The Critical Journey, focusing on growth that happens in movement towards spiritual formation. And here also you can see a few Bible texts that focus on the idea of being transformed and renewed to become more like the image of Christ. So in sum, the goal of spiritual formation, as we view it as part of this program, is to take on the character of Christ through the work of the Holy Spirit, which is a transformation that takes place really at the fundamental level of who a person is. So how they are in the world, as well as what their desires are, what their values are, and how they interact with others. Just to kind of connect it to the theme that we're focusing on here, Dallas Willard emphasizes that spiritual formation has to do with processes through which people are inwardly transformed in such a way that the personality and deeds of Jesus Christ naturally flow out from them when and wherever they are. And so the model that we're using is not that these practices or being in the image of Christ is necessarily maturationally natural, as we've been talking about some of the more fundamental religious beliefs or practices being that are based in things like the hyperactive agency detection system or theory of mind, but that this is really a more effortful process, but maybe through practice, so with the model of practice naturalness, can become something that is like second nature, that flows naturally from the person, but again, through training and instruction and practice, the rehearsal and some of the cultural scaffolding that goes along with that. So this study focused on some of those practices that could be intended to engage a person through practice to become more like Christ. And so the study isn't focused specifically on examining whether these practices lead to that naturalness, but really is focused on whether these practices, which could theoretically lead to practice naturalness, whether they relate to positive outcomes, and in that way may be an explanation for why such practices that I'm going to be talking about today persist in culture. So even though their spiritual formation is really conceptualized as the inner work of the spirit, it is still assumed that it can be encouraged through an intentional process of practices and relationships that engage the heart and the mind and the soul on a trajectory towards spiritual formation. So the goal of the study was to assess the impact of these practices specifically for the overall well-being of college students, So looking at whether this rehearsal and instruction in spiritual formation makes a difference in relation to their psychology, their emotions, their cognitive functioning, and their spiritual well-being. So I'm going to mention what these practices are that I examined. There are 2 spiritual formation practices and then also some comparison groups that I looked at. So the first one is what I'm going to describe as a spiritual movement meditation practice. This is based on Lectio Divina, so a traditional Christian practice of praying Scripture, which focuses on listening to Scripture, pondering Scripture, and then praying Scripture. And so this particular practice does that, but combines it with body movement. A lot of movement similar to yoga. So yoga flow that connects the movements to particular words in the passage. And so then the prayer takes on not only the level of pondering, listening, and praying, but also praying through movement specifically. And so it's basically a group of people that meet once a week to do this, at least how we assessed it in the study. And the common themes that they focus on with this movement meditation are things like forgiveness, peace, ministering to those who are suffering. And some key passages that are used are Psalm 23, the Sermon on the Mount, and then passages that are relevant to the participants that they want to bring in and create a flow to. So what it looks like is that different body postures are used, often yoga postures, but really any postures that the people want to bring in to connect to the passages from Scripture and use them to represent key words within the Scripture. So for example, a high lunge with raised arms might represent exalt as a key word in the passage, or some kind of kneeling position might represent humility or meekness, or warrior positions might represent being strong. And so you can see this would be representing a particular passage that as a group then they would flow through, recite the passage, listen to the passage, but then also move with the passage. Okay, so the theory behind this is that connecting the movement to the focus on the Scripture as a way of praying would refresh the mind, provide a new perspective, a new way to allow the biblical passages to sink in, also allow for motor encoding, so learning through the physical movements, and then also the idea that these body postures might cue the person to remember that content throughout the week in between sessions. So maybe you're kneeling to get something out of a kitchen cabinet and then are reminded of this body posture that represents humility or meekness, and so can integrate learning into life in that kind of a way. And so some of my research questions were, does integrating the movement and the breath exercises with Christian meditation offer unique benefits to the individual on psychological, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual levels? So meaning, does that Christian movement meditation practice show different results than more traditional spiritual formation practices? And if so, are those improvements really just based on the physical exercise component, or is there something to the integration and like the motor encoding and the theories behind the movement practice that offer benefits? So what I did was compare the spiritual movement meditation to a group that focused on more traditional spiritual formation practices like the Lectio Divina, but without the body movements, incorporating spiritual meditation and spiritual journaling, worshiping, and practicing silence, but again without the combined focus on the body positions. And then I compared those two groups. They're the first two represented here that engaged in these practices over a period of time, and then also assessed groups that were engaged in similar physical practices like yoga, Pilates, ballet, so similar movements to the spiritual movement meditation, but without integrating any kind of spiritual formation practices. So that's the physical practices group, as well as a no activity control group, just assessed at the similar time frame, college students, but not engaged in any type of training or activity related to this. So they were all assessed at the beginning and end of an 8-week period with weekly engagement in these practices or no activity in that case for the last group. However, for the traditional spiritual formation practices, That group was actually split to where some of them did a similar 8-week protocol as the spiritual movement group, but some of them did it in a shorter intensive period. So the same amount of time, the same activities, but over a 3-day intensive instead of spread over 8 weeks. And so that the traditional spiritual formation group really consists of 2 time formats. And that was more of a practical need rather than a preference for the study design. It's going to be a limitation in the study design. So I had participants complete measures before and after engaging in the 4 activities that I just mentioned. They could complete them online or on paper based on their preference, and then the measures were counterbalanced just to prevent any kind of sequencing effects. So I'll just run through briefly what the scales were that I used. So to assess the spiritual domain, I use the God image scales, the 2 of the subscales focusing on the presence of God, so whether the person views God as an abiding presence in life, really focusing on the idea of, is God there for me? So less focus on conceptual ideas about God and more focused on effective responses to God. And then acceptance by God being, am I the type of person that God accepts? Am I good enough? Is God accepting of me? Then in the emotional domain, I use the PANAS to assess positive and negative affect, and then the CESD to assess depressive symptoms. And this one is appropriate for the general population, so that's why I selected that in terms of a scale of depression. For the psychological domain, I use the brief symptom inventory. This is 53 items, so it's called brief, but it was actually the longest of my measures. And it includes 3 global indices of distress, as well as subscales that could be looked at separately. So you can see here the types of psychological symptoms that are assessed by the scale. And so I included that full range. For the cognitive domain, I included a measure of mindful awareness that focused on people's ability to be aware of their momentary experiences, including their emotions and their physical experience. And then I also included a scale of self-regulation, which assesses people's ability to regulate their attention and to maintain emotional balance while they're pursuing goals. And then for the physical domain, had just a brief kind of 5 items assessing physical health in various areas, loosely based on the SF Health survey. And then the body shape questionnaire, which assesses people's preoccupation, negative preoccupation with their body shape. So people who are worrying about or distracted by or changing their behaviors on the basis that they feel negatively about their bodies. So the participants, in the end, I had 162 participants who completed in the time 1 and the time 2. It was 78% retention from the time 2 to the time 2 in terms of those who completed measures. There weren't any demographic differences between those who did and didn't continue the study and finish out with the time 2 measures. It was mainly female for a couple of reasons. So you can see here that males were a smaller percentage of the participants. Their average age was just about 20 years old, with kind of more participants in the freshman and senior years of college, fewer in the sophomore and junior years. And then here you can see the religious affiliation, predominantly Christian participants. These are all rounded to the full percentage. So that's why some of the slices look a little bit different. But then small amounts of other religions represented. Racial breakdown, majority Caucasian, but some other races represented as well. And then here you can see the 4 conditions. So a little bit more in terms of the no activity control and the traditional spiritual practices group, and then slightly smaller for the spiritual movement meditation and the movement controls. But the breakdown was good enough to be able to conduct analyses without worrying about cell size differences. So what I did for data analyses was run a multivariate analysis of variance because of the number of outcome measures that I was looking at. So to control for type 1 errors where I'm finding things just because of the number of things that I'm looking at. And then I did that to compare differences between the 4 groups on the amount that they changed from time 1 to time 2, so from before to after they participated in their activity, to see if they differed in how much they changed compared to the other groups for each of the outcome measures. So I did look at whether the groups differed from each other to begin with because participants self-selected into their activity, meaning that I didn't randomly assign them to the groups, which is a major problem in terms of assessing differences. And so that is why I looked to see if they differed to begin with. And there were differences for gender, or there were no differences for various demographic variables, but there were differences for age. So the no activity control group was about a year younger than the other three groups. There were differences for religious and spiritual variables. In particular, the traditional spiritual formation group tended to be higher on the religious and spiritual variables. And then there were differences on levels of academic stress at the time 1 and the time 2 assessments. And that was both of the control groups. So the movement control group and the no activity control group were reporting higher levels of academic stress than the two spiritual formation groups. So I controlled for those, all the religious and spiritual variables, the age, and the levels of academic stress at time 1 and time 2 in all of the analyses that I'm going to be reporting on. So for the results here, I'm going to be running through, I don't have all the numbers incorporated, but I have graphs up that are basically showing each of the measures for which there was a difference in the amount of change across the groups. And then I'm going to be describing the pairwise comparison. So I used a Bonferroni post hoc to compare where there were significant differences, to compare which groups differed significantly from each other. And then followed that up as well with within group t-test, paired sample t-test, to see, well, if they differed, did each one individually actually significantly change from the beginning to the ends? Because some could differ from each other, but not necessarily have changed as a group significantly. So I'll just run through it based on the graph. So in terms of presence, so feeling God as an abiding presence in one's life, the spiritual formation group increased in that to a significant degree from the beginning to the end of their participation in the program. With a small effect size, so I'm also reporting effect sizes where about 0.2 to 0.5 range is considered a small effect size, so this was a small effect size. And this group, this traditional spiritual formation group, was also significantly different from the other three, or different from the movement control group and the no activity control group, not significantly different from the spiritual movement meditation group. The spiritual movement meditation group, so hopefully you can see the colors to see what the lines are represented, but the blue one, that's the spiritual movement meditation group. It was trending towards significant, but did not show a significant change from beginning to end, and it also trended in being significantly different from the no activity control group, but again, not quite. So really the traditional spiritual formation group was the only one that really showed significant change and was significantly different from the other groups. In terms of positive affect, the spiritual formation group increased again significantly in positive affect with a slightly larger effect size, but still considered small, and was different from the no activity control group, which actually decreased significantly in positive affect, and the other groups not showing a significant change from the beginning to the end of their participation. So this is the brief symptom inventory. These are the 3 global indices of psychological distress that you can see here. The first one is just general global severity of psychological symptoms. The second graph shows the severity of the symptoms, and then the third graph shows the overall number of symptoms that are being reported. And you can see that the patterns are similar. So even though severity versus number of symptoms is a little bit different in terms of the actual numbers, the patterns are going to be the same. And so what I found is that the spiritual formation group again showed the most difference from the other groups. It decreased significantly in overall symptoms of psychological distress, as well as the severity of the stress and the number of the symptoms, again with effect sizes in the small range, coming up on moderate size effect sizes. And they were significantly different from the other groups, except that they did not differ significantly from the spiritual movement meditation group when it came to the intensity of the symptoms. Then the anxiety is a subscale of the brief symptom inventory, so this showed similar trends again. So this is just one of the subcomponents of that scale that I just showed you. And here the spiritual formation group decreased in anxiety and was different from the 3 other groups, which did not change significantly from time 1 to 2 in their levels of anxiety. Somatization refers to physical symptoms that are the result of, or thought to be the result of psychological causes. And here we can see that the spiritual formation group decreased in that should say somatization, copying and pasting here, from the beginning to the end of their participation, and that they were different from the spiritual movement meditation group, which remained the same from the beginning to the end of their participation. And it was different from the no activity control group, which actually increased in somatization from the beginning to the end of their participation. And then the body shape, preoccupation. So again, this is being influenced by a negative perception of one's body. The spiritual movement meditation group here was the one that differed significantly from the beginning to the end. They decreased in the negative body shape preoccupation, and they were significantly different from the no activity control group, which increased in body shape preoccupation. So this is the one where it really stands out for the spiritual movement meditation, being different from the other groups and showing a significant change from the beginning to the end. So far, all the others have tended to be that traditional spiritual formation group that have been different. I wasn't timing myself. How am I doing on time here? Does anyone know? Getting close, or a couple more minutes? Okay. So I just ran through kind of what the significant changes were, just to remind you of the other scales that I had included, where there were no significant changes for it, or no significant differences between the groups and the amount that they changed from the beginning to end. That included feeling accepted by God, depressive symptoms, mindfulness, self-regulation, and physical health. So what it seems to be the case here from this data that even though the effect sizes were small, the traditional spiritual formation practices seem to offer some benefits to the participants in that group, including that they tended to increase in their sense of an abiding presence of God, positive affect, and decrease in psychological symptoms in comparison to the other groups. But again, this included, I'll come back to that in a second in terms of limitations. So this was the group that really stood out the most of the different interventions. The spiritual movement meditation group surprisingly didn't show the same benefits as the more traditional spiritual formation practices, but they did stand out, particularly in the area of body shape preoccupation, which does kind of make sense when you think of the practice, the spiritual movement meditation, where the body becomes a representation of the biblical texts that are being prayed. And so you could expect that that might relate to positive images of the body as opposed to negative ones. So that was the main finding for this group, but particularly surprising that it didn't show the same benefits, and also that it only trended towards significance in terms of spiritual change, given that it was focused on spiritual formation and practice. So even though the measures didn't show differences for this, as many differences for the spiritual movement meditation practice, it could be that maybe some of the measures weren't appropriate to assess this, or maybe not sensitive enough. So I wanted to share a few of the comments or the themes that came out of the qualitative comments of the participants of the spiritual movement meditation practice. So they did report that they noticed differences, that they had a deepened spiritual experience through this practice, that they personally experienced improvements in their emotional well-being, that they experienced changes in their cognition, and they particularly also highlighted the importance for them of engaging in this practice within a community, and the importance of the relationships that they experienced and the ways that they grew in relational aspects. So that maybe would have been a good area to assess quantitatively. Maybe there would have been some changes there, given that spiritual formation also is focused on learning to love others and living in love for others. So maybe that would have been something that would have come out as a significant finding if I had included measures for that. So there were a number of weaknesses in this study. Of course, the lack of random assignment. Again, I tried to control for some important variables there. But then also the fact that the traditional spiritual formation condition consisted of two formats, both the intensive short-term and the weekly longer-term formats, which again was kind of a necessity to get enough participants due to the difficulty of recruiting participants and getting them to complete measures for just doing the longer-term Lectio Divina groups. And so part of the question then is, with this group standing out so much from the other groups, was that more part of the intensive, shorter experience that they went through, as opposed to doing weekly sessions over a longer period of time? And with the breakdown of the numbers, the numbers were too uneven to really be able to compare those two formats to one another to see if that differed within that group even. So my suggestions for continuing on with this, to answer some of those questions, would be to look at differences between short intensive formats compared to longer term integrated into life formats, where it's like 2 hours a week as opposed to, like intensive retreat weekends or things like that. It's seeming here that maybe some of the weight of that difference is the result of the more intensive time period for the traditional spiritual formation groups, which maybe is a benefit if that's a way to reach students better and to create better outcomes, something that should be promoted more, as opposed to integrating it as weekly sessions into their lives. And then, of course, including different measures, maybe more sensitive measures, would have been helpful. So, all right. Thank you. I don't know how I did on time, but
Good. We have time for a couple brief questions.
Would it be possible at your school to have run this as where you did randomly assign the participants to different groups? I mean, you didn't, I'm assuming, just because of convenience sake, but would it be?
Well, we didn't, because we do have the psychology students are required to participate in research, and so that's normally our subject pool. But to ask students to participate in 8 weeks, 2 hours a week, goes much beyond the credits that we offer them for that. And so that's why it was kind of a necessity to use self-selected students, because to require students to participate in that many hours for their research credit, isn't really an option. And so unless we're providing them some kind of incentive for participating, or they're doing it because they want to participate, then we end up with the problem.
Could you have had all the people that sign up, that half of them that want to do it, half of them do it now, and then the other half is the control group? They have to wait for 6 weeks or a month or whatever till they get to do it?
That would be an option. So the spiritual movement meditation condition actually came from a PE class, so it's offered for credit. And so that would be a little bit difficult in terms of telling some students you can't take this class right now. So those are just some of the limitations of the logistics that I was working with. Though that would be a good idea. If we weren't recruiting specifically from a PE class, that would have been a better option of doing it that way. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You used this phrase, exactly on which slide it was, but it seemed like a metric about needing to create a sense of flow with respect to Christian meditation. What does that mean? What does it mean to create a sense of flow? What was that?
Yeah. So, that one's kind of cueing into two aspects. So yoga flow is a common term used for yoga practitioners, where it's a flow between body postures. So there are standard practices where there are body positions, and then movement between them is called the flow. But then flow also, in positive psychology, the idea of this cognitive experience of being intensely engaged in what you're doing in the moment, in the sense that you kind of lose sense of time, you lose all distractions, and you're really fully engrossed in what you're doing. And so it kind of relates to both of those concepts in this format.
To what extent do you think that were these students, particularly in the movement program, familiar with doing other movement practices? And do you think that could have taken away from maybe the spiritual experiences as they're trying to go through or master some of these types of movements?
So you're saying if they were new to the physical body postures, could that have been more of a distraction as opposed to something that created flow? I think that is a possibility. But I think the strength of that condition was that it was an 8-week period. And so hopefully, maybe those first few times are going to be more distracting. Excuse me. But that as they get more used to it, I think 8 weeks is long enough to habituate to the newness of that. So hopefully that would be washed out by the end of it. But I think that would be a concern, particularly if it were a shorter period of time.
Okay, thank you.
So my topic is born believers in denial. I just read what I've written so that you can decipher my English. recent findings in the cognitive science of religion indicate that human beings are born believers, as Barrett has been teaching us, in a super creative God. And so the question is, if people naturally believe in God, why are there atheists? And there are two basic answers. The naturalistic answer is that people are enlightened by evolutionary science and realize that belief in God is an illusion produced by evolution. And the theistic answer is that people are blinded by their prejudices and the relevant cognitive faculties become deactivated or malfunctioning. And I'll be pursuing this theistic answer, and I'll try to use this naturalistic answer as a proof to support the theistic answer. And the theistic answer that I'm proposing is based on the claim that the God instinct, I use the word God instinct, which Jesse Baring uses, that the God instinct is fragile in the sense that it's intuitive and it's vulnerable to various counter influences. So it's persistent. God instinct is persistent, but it's fragile in the sense that it can be suppressed or ignored most of the time. And as an example of what it means that it's fragile, Charles Darwin admitted that he often intuitively sensed nature as intelligently designed. George Douglas Campbell tells of a discussion he had with Darwin 1 year before the latter's death. In the course of that conversation, I said to Mr. Darwin, with reference to some of his own remarkable works on the fertilization of orchids and various other observations he made of the wonderful contrivances for certain purposes in nature, I said it was impossible to look at this without seeing that they were the effects and the expression of mind. I shall never forget Mr. Darwin's answer. He looked at me very hard and said, "Well, that often comes over me with overwhelming force, but at other times," and he shook his head vaguely, adding, "it seems to go away." So in that sense, the God instinct is fragile. It can come, we look at the beautiful scenery and we can have a strong, overwhelming sense that this has been created by God, but then it can easily go away. And the occasions when the God instinct comes upon a person with an overwhelming force are rare in an urban culture, which provides many opportunities for distraction and entertainment. And if this natural God instinct is not strengthened by an actual encounter with God, so I make a difference between a natural God instinct and an actual encounter with God. Then when we are in personal relationship with God, and then it can be overwhelmed by a cultural atmosphere that is generally skeptical of the reliability of such intuitive convictions and hostile to the idea of a creator of the universe. And why is God instinct fragile in this? Why is it intuitive? Why has, from the theistic point of view, why has God created us into such beings who have this kind of fragile sense of God intuitively? And I think it's because human beings should be equal in their ability to know God. Since this design recognition it's non-inferential by nature, then this means that even mentally handicapped people are able to discern God, since this discernment is received without the mediation of inference. This kind of design recognition conveys immediate knowledge of a divine designer. This may then explain why such a belief is natural to children, but may be lost to people who are well educated and thus acquire the ability to argue against this natural tendency to believe in God. So this means, Budziszewski would say, there are certain forms of stupidity that require high levels of education and intelligence, because then you can intelligently deceive yourself. Okay? And so the idea is that, instinctively or intuitively we have this kind of sense of God, And it's admitted even by naturalists like Francis Crick, who says that biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. So if you constantly have to do this, then it means you have some intuitive sense that it was designed. And how does one then lose touch with God? According to a theistic explanation, unbelievers have somehow lost touch with the evidence produced by the God instinct. Theistic explanations appeal to various ways that human cognitive faculties may fail to function properly and to various reasons for their malfunction. One reason may be some kind of degeneration or lack of activation of the relevant cognitive faculties, which makes it more difficult for people to discern God. The fact that many naturalists experience the God instinct only vaguely, if at all, is explained either by a failure to exert or to train them properly. I mean, in this logic. And here I'm using Barrett's book, chapter 9. He's vaguely using, I'm not sure if Barrett is happy with the way I'm using it, but in any case, I'm happy. So many personal and social environmental factors may contribute toward this. Some people may have an inherited genetic predisposition that makes them less likely to detect intentional agency around them and makes them weak in social cognitive abilities. If they are weak in detecting intentional agency in general, they are less likely to detect signs of divine agency. I mean, that's one reason. Then there are social factors. There are also various social factors that impede the proper functioning of cognitive faculties, deactivating them and leaving them untrained. For example, someone on whom no one else is dependent, someone who lacks strong social bonds, consisting of intimate and dependent social relationships, does not experience any acute need to look for divine assistance. A leisurely social setting does not encourage people to cultivate their cognitive faculties in ways that make them sensitive in their ability to discern divine action. Atheism seems to be most widespread in relatively affluent post-industrial societies where people live in safety and experience less urgency to detect intentional agency. And then there are cultural factors which may undermine belief in the reliability of such intuitive convictions. The capacity to interpret one's God instinct in an appropriate framework may be weakened by ideologies and myths prevalent in a culture. For example, the idea of a God may seem superfluous to a person who has been raised within the framework of a naturalistic reductionism. A culture may indoctrinate a person against recognizing the hand of God in nature by ascribing agent-like features to pseudo-agents like chance, natural selection, and destiny. And such a cultural atmosphere may provide a person with an excuse to ignore intuitive evidence that is otherwise clearly discernible. And third, the idea of a cosmic authority with the power to determine the morally right and wrong and to make human beings answerable for their behavior may be repulsive to a person raised in a culture which places high value on individual autonomy. And it has also been suggested that there are psychological and moral reasons that lead people to suppress their knowledge about God and live in denial. Moral factors like guilt may create a tendency for a person to prefer an impersonal universe that does not require human beings to give an account of their behavior. This kind of argument is analogical to the one that sees religious belief as a projection. And for example, Freud says religious ideas have arisen from the same needs as have all the other achievements of civilization, from the necessity of defending oneself against the crushing superior force of nature. So he says religious beliefs are illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind, and so on. And in the first quotation, Freud admits that his argument about the psychological origin of religious belief is equally valid against all the other achievements of civilization. This implies that it is valid against atheism and agnosticism as well. Paul Witz takes his cue from here in developing a projection theory of atheism. And his argument can be strengthened by the evidence produced by the cognitive science of religion. In this way, it is possible to develop a projection theory of atheism according to which wishful thinking may lead human beings to suppress their natural knowledge of God so thoroughly that they almost completely forget that they know anything about God. For example, Nagel writes, I'm talking about something much deeper, namely the fear of religion itself. I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. I want atheism to be true, and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief, it's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. So, and this wishful thinking and this denial can come in degrees. It can lead a person to completely forget ever having any knowledge of God. And in a more moderate cases, it produces a failure to appreciate its proper evidential significance. But the basic question, is it fair to ascribe such psychological causes for faith in God or the lack of it? One reason for such projection theories is that the epistemic chasm between believers and unbelievers is enormous, as pointed out by Thomas Nagel. He writes, my instinctively atheistic perspective implies that if I ever found myself flooded with the conviction that what the Nicene Creed says is true, the most likely explanation would be that I was losing my mind, not that I was being granted the gift of faith. From Plantinga's point of view, by contrast, I suffer from a kind of spiritual blindness from which I am unwilling to be cured. This is a huge epistemological gulf, and it cannot be overcome by the cooperative employment of the cognitive faculties that we share, as is the hope with scientific disagreements. So, I mean, that's this kind of epistemic chasm is a reason to believe. To think that that's, at least it's reasonable to assume this kind of one. And then this idea of suppression as subconscious. But the last point, what is the evidence for this kind of denial? And here, so how can theists then justify their claim that atheism and agnosticism are based on the suppression of the original knowledge of God, which leads to living in denial? Based on his work on human self-deception, J. Budziszewski has suggested two main arguments. If people tend not to live according to their professed convictions in practice, but base their practical lives on convictions that they explicitly deny, one may assume that at some level they themselves know things to be different from what they publicly profess. So that's one thing, if they live different from what they profess to believe. And the second is, if otherwise intelligent people begin to make major blunders in reasoning in areas that protect their most cherished convictions, one may be justified in assuming that wishful thinking is hindering the proper functioning of their cognitive capacities. So these two arguments. First, there's this cognitive dissonance argument. One reason to suspect that unconscious suppression of knowledge is a persistent phenomenon of cognitive dissonance. This may take many forms, but one of them is represented by a person who knows something and cannot help acting according to her knowledge, but still denies having the relevant knowledge. The suppression hypothesis receives some support from the fact that in spite of the doubts and counter-arguments, naturalists often live in practice as if the information provided by the God instinct were reliable and true. This applies especially to the anthropological implications of the God instinct. That means, for example, the human self-understanding implicit in the God instinct. What kind of human self-understanding is implied in the natural belief in God as described by the cognitive science of religion? First of all, the God instinct implies that human beings are created for a purpose. As a result, human beings naturally understand themselves as beings whose life has a meaning within the context of an all-encompassing plan that transcends our subjective aspirations. One part of this self-understanding is that human beings have a moral obligation to fulfill the purpose for which they were created. This leads to a sense of, and so on. The God instinct produces such a deep conviction about the meaning of human life that even atheists often think, speak, and act as if life had a meaning within the framework of an overall plan. In her dissertation, Bethany Haywood found evidence for atheists to cover a tendency to believe that life has a meaning and design. In Haywood's empirical research, 2/3 of the atheists had made at least one response betraying their implicit view that everything happens for a reason. There was only a statistical negligible difference between the responses of the believers and the unbelievers with regard to the question whether they thought that the significant events in their life had an inherent reason or purpose. And so on. I have to skip a little bit. So my question is, why isn't the naturalist able to extricate herself from the practical implications of the conviction that life has a meaning, which is, against naturalism. Naturalism believes there is no purpose. Is it because this conviction is reflective of a knowledge that she cannot not know, even though she wants to suppress it? Is this an indication that actually they believe in the depths of their heart that there is a God and there is a purpose, even though they deny it, because they keep living as if there was meaning in their lives? And then the second and last point is the second indication for this kind of denial is systematic errors in thinking. And here I'm using actually the naturalistic argument for why there are atheists. Because the naturalistic argument actually is that there are atheists. I'll just skip a little bit. Naturalists assume that the advance of science has provided us with knowledge of the evolutionary basis of the God instinct and has thereby made us aware of its illusory nature. So they say that the more enlightened members of culture will use this new knowledge to get rid of religious illusions. But the problem with this naturalistic explanation is that it undermines our trust in all our knowledge, since the same evolutionary argument applies to all the products of our cognitive faculties, because the cognitive toolkit that produces belief in God is not an isolated faculty responsible for religious beliefs, but consists of the same set of cognitive faculties that produces the knowledge necessary for conduct in everyday life, as well as the knowledge required for this naturalistic argument. Thus, this naturalistic reason for rejecting the reliability of the faculties producing belief in God is self-defeating. It assumes the reliability of those cognitive faculties whose unreliability it tries to prove with regard to belief in God. So that's what I'm... So, and this is a more general problem. It's not just this argument. But in any, there's a general problem that Plantinga has pointed out, that naturalism has a defeater that cannot be defeated. Naturalism undermines the idea that we have reliable cognitive faculties. Since naturalists believe in naturalism on the basis of these supposedly unreliable cognitive faculties, they don't have a reason to be naturalists. So, I think I heard there's an expression in English, shooting oneself in one's leg. Yeah. What I would here need is the expression shooting oneself in one's head and trying to prove one's intelligence by doing that. So, that's the argument. So, my question is as follows: is this blunder so elementary and so obviously biased for the protection of the naturalistic belief system that it belies the process of suppression? Is it possible that otherwise intelligent people would fall into such an elementary mistake in thinking if there was not a process of denial going on? People making this blunder have minds that are trained for detecting just these kinds of errors. Why does the error persist, and why has it received an almost axiomatic stamp in the naturalistic discourse? So that's it.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for a couple questions.
Okay, yeah.
There's another expression in English. It's called swinging for the fences, which is when the person advances a really bold thesis to try and so I think you swung for the fences here. You said something like the God instinct implies that people are created for a purpose.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, why should we think that that's true? I mean, you might think that the God instinct implies that people might typically believe that they're created for a purpose, or at the very least, a culturally recurrent, God instinct implies that people are going to believe that they're in a world that includes supernatural agents. But that's one thing to say that, but why would you think that just having this instinct implies that we are created for a purpose? Because that kind of seems to generate the dissonance that you think the atheist is.
Yeah, because I thought that, let's say, if God is good, why would he create a person without a purpose? I mean, that would... So I suppose the God instinct implies the idea somehow that God is good. And then it means, you don't create then a person for no purpose. That would be like cruel or yeah. What else?
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to take on a much less serious philosophical topic than what we just heard, and go after something really quite simple. So we tend to believe, without terribly good evidence, that our lives persist beyond death. And so what gives ground to this? We have stories that we've heard, we've got intuitions that we carry with us. And so there are a lot of things from the cognitive science religion perspective that have been suggested as far as why we have these, and there's been some evidence. And I think that evidence has been quite interesting, but I want to dive into it a little bit more. And so we've talked quite a bit. I think I'm going to skip through some of these initial intuitions because most of us are familiar with them. But we have this ontological category of person, and this has a lot that it entails. And these inherited features of this category of person sometimes give us really solid intuitions, and in other cases, they give us intuitions that may go far beyond what maybe they were originally intended for or the way that they were developed. And so they might be artifacts of a sort. And so at this point, I'm going to blow through this and assume that most people know what theory of mind is in the room. But one of the key elements in the way that I like to conceptualize it, based on some of Jesse Baring's work, he's pointed out that it's difficult for us to imagine the absence of certain experiences. And so these are going to be what he calls difficult to imagine the absence of states. And then there are some other experiential states that are more simple to imagine their absence. And so, I was hungry before lunch. I ate lunch. I experienced the absence of hunger. I can close my eyes and negate some of my perceptual experience. So these are things that can be sort of blotted out, but it's very hard for me to imagine not having any emotional status whatsoever, or having complete absence of any desire status or knowledge status. What is it like not to know? Well, that's not something that I readily experience. And so he's made this argument that these easy to imagine the absence of EIA states, drift off rather quickly after a death event, and these difficult to imagine the absence of states persist. And so we have birth, death, we have this lifespan, and these guys are just going to sort of float away, and these are going to persist. Now, one of the things that I think is important to note as we conceptualize this is that these difficult to imagine the absence of states just so happen to be ones for which we have very sparse information. So you can imagine that Jim could tell me what his desires are, and I could observe him for a long period of time, and I actually don't get a huge amount of data that speaks exactly to his desire. Whereas if Jim says that he sees something and he walks over and picks it up, this behavior immediately speaks to that perceptual ability, that perceptual status, in a much deeper way. So there's a difference in the density of data that we can collect and the intuitions that we can draw. And so I don't know that these are fundamentally different in terms of their kind, but they are different in terms of the ease with which we can access data that speak to them or make observations that speak to them. So I'd like to point that out just as a starting point. So our question for the study is basically, if the dead persist as persons and retain some desire or intentional stance, emotional states, epistemic states, can they actually change? So in the way that we can change during our lifespan, can the dead also change after the death event? And so if that's true, under what conditions can they actually gain new information? And can they gain information in the ways that we can readily gain information? Or do they have new avenues for acquiring information? So these are the questions that we set out. And so some of this comes from this idea. Let's take Boyé's example of a ghost. So a ghost is, in Boyé's terminology of counterintuitive or breaches, so it's a person that doesn't actually follow any sort of coherent physics. And one of the things that's sort of amusing to me about this notion is that ghosts can see, right? And ghosts can hear. And how would one hear unless there are air molecules and matter that would be able to take a signal and transfer? So ghosts shouldn't be able to see walls, much less be inhibited by them. Ghosts shouldn't be able to hear anything that we say, as in the same way that they shouldn't be able to be moved by the wind. And so there's this weird sort of decoherence of what an intuitive physical world is as we start to posit these. So this is part of what we're trying to go after is, okay, so obviously the physical world is absolutely fractured. So what about the epistemic world? And can they actually understand things that they weren't present for or didn't have access to when the event happened? Can we mess with what time is as well? And does it fracture in an interesting way too? So our question is that our hypothesis becomes a little bit more specific. So we hypothesize that new knowledge or methods for accessing new knowledge are attributed to deceased individuals following the death event. We look at stories of ghosts and hauntings and how they arise, and in many, many cultures we tend to see that these stories are centered on intentional wrongdoing and the persistence of an individual who has died that is associated with that. So, we have a murder or something like this, and there is the haunting of that murderer, and there's some sort of moral imperative embedded within a lot of these stories. And so maybe this is one of those things that's going to access this type of information and lead to potentially some sort of breakdown in theory of mind such that we can start attributing things inappropriately. So I know it as an observer because I read the story. The person in the story didn't know it. But now, because of this particular intentional stance that they were victim to, they've now acquired that information, even though we've explicitly stated in the story that they didn't know. So we haven't managed to finish data collection yet, so please note that this is on its way. So we've got, at this point, 32 students from Bethel University. It's a small evangelical Christian college in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so here's some demographic information. So aged 18 to 22 years old, average age 20.4. We've got almost a 50-50 split for males and females. We are comparing them to a set of Japanese students from Rikyo University in Tokyo. These are again, 18 to 22 years old. They're a little bit younger, but not much of a difference here. So we're looking at this. So you can see an evangelical Christian university. We've got many more Christians than any other category. Among the Japanese students, we're getting a different distribution, very much. So we had one Christian in our group. So we're collecting more data from another university with whom we're collaborating. So again, we've got almost a 50-50 split with males and females. So here, let me give you an overview of how we conducted our studies now that you've got a bit of an intuition for who the people are. So students read a short first-person narrative, or I guess an omniscient narrative. That's wrong, the first person. So they read a narrative about the death of a main character of a story. The students then answered a series of questions about the death event and the main character's biological status, perceptions, emotions, desires, and knowledge, and those states after death. The students then answered a couple of questions regarding their own feelings and conceptions of death, and then we got some demographic information from them. All narratives and questionnaires were presented in the students' native language, so for Japanese students, read everything in Japanese. We had a wonderful young undergraduate aspiring linguist who was very happy to do very good translations for us. So that was really nice. Just to give you a sense of the story, let me just blow through this quick. So Sam's a university student, some background information. We wind up talking about a lot of, he goes to a platform, he's waiting for a train, he's experiencing all of these different things. So he's looking forward to going home. We're articulating physical feelings that he has, his physical state, psychobiological states, emotional state, desires, and some of his knowledge. And what we then do is we have this. Just then Sam hears a rumbling, turns to see if his train is approaching. Everyone behind him rushes forward, ready to board the train, and now we have this context surrounding the death. And inevitably what happens is he's knocked off the platform as the train hurtles into the station. It hits him with such force that it kills him. He lies dead on his back in the hot sun blazing down his body on the tracks. A shocked crowd gathers, looks down at Sam's body. Paramedics are called, hurriedly arrive at the scene, and this is where things end in our story. And so we put in 3 different conditions for this narrative. And these conditions simply talked about the identity of the individual and their intentional status of the person that wound up killing our character by pushing him off the platform. So in the first case, Sam sneezes again, just as everyone starts pushing behind him. The crowd surges forward, he tumbles off the platform. So we don't know the identity of the killer as readers of the story, and it seems to be an accident. The second case, we have a known individual. So in this case, now it's the schoolmate who unwittingly bumps Sam off the platform and Sam dies. In the third case, this schoolmate quickly steps forward and shoves Sam off the platform. So now in this case, Sam does know the individual, but it's also an intentional push that has wound up leading to Sam's death. And so these are the 3 conditions. So we wanted to look at these, and I'll wind up grouping some of these for analysis and as we go. So we used some standard batteries. So we used items that Baring used in his 2002 study that other groups have used. We also used a couple of items from the Belief in Afterlife scale and selected items from the Death Anxiety scale. We also put in the 3 extra questions that were of very big interest to us. So we wanted to look at emotional status. So, if it was an accident, Sam doesn't really have any reason to be upset with his schoolmate. So we thought, this question will wind up being interesting, and this anger is a little bit more specific. So the upset is just supposed to get at, well, there's a large emotional response to this. And then finally, does Sam know the identity of the person who pushed him? So you remember, if we go back, in all three, so in the first case, it was just a complete accident. We didn't say anything about it. But in the second two cases where it was Sam's schoolmate that was the one that was responsible for his death, we explicitly said, Sam doesn't know. And so we've put that in. We told the students that this was a reading comprehension task, and so we would be asking them a number of questions about it. So they're supposed to be reading very specifically. So we're really interested in this. So just to begin, let's look at the death anxiety and afterlife belief scales. So American and Japanese students, we didn't see any difference in the anxiety that they express about death. So relatively low levels, not surprising for college kids. So then the Japanese students were much less likely to commit to the existence of an afterlife. They were much more likely to say death is the end. Existence ceases in all of its forms. So this is a very explicit measure, though, and this is going to stand in stark contrast to when we start asking them questions about, well, does Sam's brain still work? Most of the time, people are going to say, no, absolutely not. So there's a discontinuity that occurs with the death event. But if you ask a question like, does Sam continue to love his mom? Now you get a whole lot more people saying yes, even though they may have formally said, no, death is the absolute end of life. There is no more existence. They're still answering yes to this. So what we see is sort of this standard version of this curve where the biological stuff, that stops. The perceptual stuff winds up usually stopping quite frequently. But when we get over to these three categories of the emotional states, the desires, and the epistemic states that are attributed to the deceased, these persist beyond the death event. Now, there's something interesting that's going on here with our American students, and I'm going to come back to this. But this is very different from what other groups have found, and this was really solid actually through our student group, and I have a speculative reason for that, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So just to give you a sense of what other people have found, just pull this dot down to about here, and that's what these data normally look like. All right, so now to the questions that are of particular interest. Oh, I should make one last comment. So we've grouped across treatment conditions. There were no differences. All of the groups landed smack on top of each other. The treatment condition didn't alter any of the responses to those standard items. Now, when we get to these questions, we wind up seeing that Sam is not upset with his schoolmates. So in this case, I've thrown out all of the data from that first treatment condition where Sam was pushed by an unknown person. So what we see here is that very few people in the intentional or the non-intentional conditions are saying that Sam is in fact upset with his schoolmate. So now when we move on to the next question, we actually see something that's a little bit interesting, I think culturally. The American students wind up saying, for the most part, either in the in the intentional condition or the non-intentional condition, Sam's not angry at the person that pushed them. But the Japanese students, when Sam was killed by this bumbling idiot who just sort of runs into the back of him, knocks him off, they get upset, but when it's malicious, they don't. And so there's some really interesting cultural issues that rise up here. And for those of you who are interested in Japanese culture, we can talk about those, but I don't feel well enough educated to speculate on that. But it's an interesting thing. It's approaching, it's significant, but it's not actually statistically valid because we don't have enough subjects for all of the cells of the chi-squared. You guys know this. So, all right, now we get to the question that is really of significant interest to me, and that is, does Sam know the identity of the person who pushed him? And what we see is that this distribution winds up being, when it's intentional, 50-50. So it's almost an even split. Half of our subjects are saying, yes, Sam does know who pushed him off the platform, the identity of this person. However, in the non-intentional, it's much, much more that, no, he doesn't really know who this is. So this is a subset of students that are winding up saying that, yes, Sam has somehow acquired this knowledge that was not accessible until after death. So what this does is it puts us in an interesting position. The students, so both American and Japanese students, so we saw similar results across both student groups. They were more likely to attribute knowledge of the killer's identity to the victim. My initial thought, and the reason that we wound up putting in the emotional questions was, I thought there would be some sort of sense of injustice, and that would operate through an emotional conduit and basically force us into, okay, well, now I feel so strongly about this that I will then attribute this knowledge state. And so what was surprising to me was the fact that there wasn't this emotional response. We didn't attribute emotions to Sam. The students generally didn't do that. They just attributed knowledge. So this was a very interesting sort of split, very much unanticipated. So this is the way that I parse it out, and I'd love to talk with those of you who've spent a lot more time thinking about some of these theory of mind issues. So two explanations that I can come up with quickly to explain these data. First of all, we can have a failure in theory of mind in which knowledge is inappropriately attributed to the victim when the victim's death was intentional. So this inappropriate attribution is conditional. And it's conditioned upon the particular intentional stance of the person who led to the death. So that would be a more technical theory of mind and a failure in our standard cognitive mechanisms. The other explanation is that an implicit belief or intuition that individuals who are killed intentionally have methods for us accessing that knowledge which are unavailable to the living. So this means that they have some sort of new epistemic path. And so in the way that, I can't go back to the previous talk re-experiencing that and then suddenly, I know exactly what was going on if I missed it. It seems that perhaps the dead have an opportunity to do that. Now, there are a lot of possibilities for how this could happen. Justin, I think, last night said, the spirit world is filled with gossips. And so it may be the fact that there is some spirit with whom that this new spirit, this newly disembodied spirit, can interact and get that information. And so that's one possibility that maybe we've tapped into sort of unwittingly. But this suggests something of a society through which information can be transferred. So this is an interesting approach. So the final thing, what happened to desire for the evangelicals? So some of you may know John Piper's work in Desiring God, and desire is a very, very interesting thing that exists within evangelical culture and theology. And in many cases, desire is synonymous with that which is bad. And so, to me, my speculation, and this is pure speculation on my part, is that for some of these evangelical kids, death represents this cessation of that which torments us. And so death, I'll be in a better state, I'll be with God, and this desire which has been at the center of so many of my problems will dissipate and I'll be left. And so I wonder if one of the differences between our study and other studies, other previous work, is that we're looking at a group of students, a group of Christians that view desire as such a bad thing that they're absolutely happy to get rid of it. So to summarize, the dead apparently can acquire knowledge about events that occurred prior to death. This attribution occurred only after when the deceased individual was intentionally pushed off the train platform. It doesn't seem to coincide with attributions of strong generalized emotions, being upset, or a specific emotion, anger. And so this seems to be either a new epistemic method that's available or a specific failure of attributions that go along with theory of mind. So this, I would submit, may be a central contributor to stories of ghosts and hauntings. So with that, a couple of collaborators that I'd like to thank: Cameron Larson, an undergraduate student, Joel Fredrickson, social psychologist in the department, and our translator. So thank you very much.
Okay, we can push into the break just a little bit with a couple questions.
Yes.
This is a fascinating study, but I have a worry about it, and that is the very specific formulation of your question. Does Sam know the identity of the person who pushed him?
Yes.
That question's ambiguous. And it should have been, does Sam know that that person pushed him?
Yes.
And because of the ambiguity, it seems to me it's a pretty serious problem for
Yeah.
findings.
So so if that is a problem, and I readily admit that it's a problem with the way that that sentence was structured, why would we see the results that we do?
Because he did know the identity of the person who pushed him.
But why do we see it specifically and primarily in the intentional status? So the only way that I can push back is by saying, if that question basically boils down to, do I know Justin? Well, I know Justin regardless of what he does to me. So his intentional status doesn't actually matter for the way that I answer that question. And yet we found a difference that is consistent. And so, yes, the sentence from a syntactic, from a structural perspective, is not solid. But the results seem to speak to the students may have had that ambiguity available as a formal possibility, but tended to interpret it in sort of the way that we were hoping. So, Myron?
So there were two instances in which the individual was known,
Yep.
which would give rise to the possibility of ambiguity, but only in one case where the known individual intended to harm. Saying that's where so there was a big difference in both cases of the known individual.
Yeah. So, and that's what we saw. So we saw no difference in the responses between in the case where the person who pushed was absolutely unknown, and the person who pushed was known but had an unintentional stance in contributing to the death.
Can you get the questions back for us?
Yeah. So you can eviscerate me? Somebody didn't go through, what was the Great Canadian Education that... So these are the questions. Yeah.
The second question is ambiguous.
Yes.
Could you, if you put a now in there, is Sam now angry at the person who pushed him?
Yeah.
Does Sam now know the identity of the person who pushed him?
Mm-hmm.
So there's the sense that, okay, he's lying there dead.
Yeah.
Does he know this now?
Yeah. That would clean up some issues.
But are all the questions prefaced to say we're buried now that he's dead?
Yes. So they're all prefaced with, now that he's dead.
Oh, that's kind of in there.
So.
And they get all three of these questions, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Every student receives these questions.
And always in this order?
Yes, always in this order, because we wanted to make sure that if there was a conduit through emotion that, Adam.
I thought an interesting follow-up on this might be one story on which it's, the person who gets pushed is easy to empathize with, and one person in which they're hard to empathize with, or like get their just desserts, something like this. Because I wonder if one possible explanation of what's going on. It doesn't seem to me that people have some theory about gossiping spirits, and that this somehow is how we're getting effect. But something that seems more plausible to me is something like you have quarantine failure You have empathy plus quarantine failure, maybe filtered by some thought, about really bodily linked states not applying, but the epistemic ones remain even after the filtering. So, if I empathize a lot with the guy, it's a wrongful death, right? Maybe even a wrongful death by a friend. Then I have this strong reaction to what's happened. But what if I don't have that strong reaction? Does the effect remain? I'm not an experimentalist person, but if you accept suggestions from the Holger, that would be interesting to me.
5 years ago, I had never done a human study. I'd only worked with rats, so I'm very, very willing to accept suggestions from people who know more than I do. So, is that all our time? All right. Thank you.
This concludes session 3.